Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another sutta study at Empty Cloud Monastery. So welcome to everyone who's joining in this morning. So far, only Kausar Friend has said anything. So welcome, Kausar Friend. Good afternoon to you. I believe you're in Europe, is that correct? As usual, I'll read through this sutta and give some explanations, and then at the end I'll take any questions that you have. And hello as well to Robin and Michael. Good to see both of you, and Suzanne, Elaine, good to see you. And Sarah and Denise, good morning, good morning. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today we'll be looking at the Titayatana Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya Chapter 3, Sutta number 62, which is translated here as Standpoints of Other Religions. And this is closely related to the discourse I spoke about yesterday. So the discourse I spoke about yesterday was specifically around somebody asking the Buddha about predeterminism. Asking the Buddha how he felt about the belief that some people had, that everything we experience is predetermined. And the Buddha rejects that standpoint and speaks about how what we experience has causes and conditions which are the result of our own past karma. So this sutta today, similarly, the Buddha is addressing, again, the issue of causality, the issue of karma. Again, this is another sutta which is sometimes used to try to prop up the belief that not everything we experience is the result of karma. But when you look at the sutta, that's not actually what the Buddha is saying. The Buddha is actually saying the exact opposite. The Buddha is stating that the principles of moral causality are the underpinnings of the Dhamma. That he most certainly is not rejecting that or limiting that in any way. So yesterday we went through a fairly thorough explanation of why predeterminism is not compatible with Buddhism. Here the Buddha, he starts by expanding that to include 3 viewpoints, so predeterminism being one, but he includes 2 others which also are contrary to the Buddha's teachings on moral causality. And then after that, he goes into some explanations of some standard Buddhist doctrines. So as usual, I'll start reading through the sutta, and please feel free to enter your questions at any time. So the Buddha says, monks, there are 3 standpoints of other religions which, if a wise person examines, probes, and questions, can be seen to result in a rejection of moral causality. What 3? Monks, there are some contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief. Everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, is entirely predetermined. So this first one is the standpoint that we went over thoroughly in yesterday's discourse. So I won't speak too much about it today because we already spoke about it quite a bit yesterday. And the second one, the Buddha says, monks, there are some contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief. Everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, is entirely caused by a creator deity. So this is another viewpoint that people sometimes have. They say, well, God made me do it. oh, God is inflicting this on me, or God is giving this to me. This is a gift from God. This is a punishment from God. This is the work of God. It's another way people sometimes speak. Then the third one, he says, monks, there are some contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief. Everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, has no cause or condition at all. So this third one is, this third viewpoint is the belief that everything happens entirely randomly and chaotically, that there is no underlying causal structure to reality at all, that our experiences are just happening completely randomly for no reason whatsoever. So this is another viewpoint that actually very few people genuinely hold. There's another sutta where somebody comes to the Buddha expressing a similar belief, and the Buddha's like, well, not even you believe this. Your very actions contradict this belief. You act as though there is causality. You act as though your choices matter. How can you claim to believe otherwise? So this is it's a viewpoint in which people tend to, if they hold this viewpoint, they hold it intellectually, but they don't actually live in accordance with it. Anyway, so then the Buddha goes through each of these three viewpoints. So first off, he says, in that case, monks, regarding those contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief, everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, is entirely predetermined. I approach them and say, is it true that you, venerables, express this doctrine and hold this belief? When asked, they affirm yes. So I find it interesting here that the first thing the Buddha does is he seeks for confirmation from the person. He's like, is this actually what you believe? Is this really what you teach? Is this really the viewpoint that you're putting forward in the world? So the Buddha doesn't just go on secondhand reports or stories or rumor. He first gets the person to admit themselves what it is they believe. And this also is something that we see throughout the suttas, is that whenever the Buddha is debating with someone, he always makes an effort to get the other person to, there's an archaic idiom, hoist themselves by their own petard. So like to hang themselves with their own rope, you might say. Like the Buddha is always trying to get the other person to talk themselves into a corner, which is usually not particularly difficult for him. The Buddha was a master debater, among many other excellent qualities. He was very good at debating with people. Anyway, so he gets the person to admit that they believe in predeterminism. And it says, then I say to them, therefore, if you kill, then it was predetermined. If you steal, then it was predetermined. If you break your celibacy, tell lies, speak divisively, speak harshly, speak uselessly, covet, have aversion, or hold wrong beliefs, it was predetermined. And he says, monks, one who returns to predetermination as the essence has no interest or engagement in knowing what is to be done and what is not to be done. Without any true and reliable sense of what is to be done and what is not to be done, they live mindlessly and recklessly and cannot reasonably be called contemplatives. Monks, this is my first reasonable refutation of the doctrines and beliefs of those contemplatives and priests. So, in other words, what the Buddha is saying here is that if you believe everything is predetermined, then what you're saying is that you don't believe in free will. You believe someone who believes everything is predetermined also believes that the actions and decisions which they're taking are out of their control, that they're simply watching a movie of their own life rather than creating the story as they go along. They're just watching the story unfold. So this is someone who then believes that free will is an illusion. And therefore, such a person, actually, they tend to just run on their impulses, thinking that impulse is simply the motive force of reality. Impulse is simply predeterminism playing itself out. So such a person is actually giving up their own capacity to make choices. They're choosing to act on impulse and intuition rather than on reasoned, careful reflection, rather than on a basis of wise self-restraint. So the Buddha is saying, so somebody who has this viewpoint, they won't make any effort in trying to learn what's right and what's wrong. And they won't make any effort to do what's right instead of what's wrong. They'll just live in a mindless and reckless way. Because someone who really genuinely believes that there's no such thing as free will won't make any effort to exercise that free will, and won't make any effort to learn what choices are good and what choices are bad, because they don't believe that choices make any difference in the first place. They don't believe that choice is real anyway. So the Buddha rejects this because it's a completely self-destructive viewpoint. It cuts one off entirely from any path which leads towards awakening. Then the second case, he says, regarding those contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief, everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, is entirely caused by a creator deity. And then again, he approaches the person and asks them, is this what you believe? And they say yes. And then he says to them, therefore, if you kill, steal, break celibacy, tell lies, speak divisively, speak harshly, speak uselessly, covet, have aversion, or hold wrong beliefs, then it was caused by a creator deity. And similarly, he says, monks, one who returns to a creator deity as the essence. So the essence means the core principle of their belief system. So one who returns to a creator deity as the essence has no interest or engagement in knowing what is to be done and is not to be done. And as before, he says they live mindlessly and recklessly. So this is the case of a person who says, again, God is in control of everything. We just need to trust in God's plan and let things unfold according to God's plan. Well, and the Buddha is saying, well, that's an incredibly foolish way to live your life, because then you won't take the reins. You won't take control of your own choices. You won't take control of your own life. So one particularly harmful example of this is the belief held by some Protestant denominations, the belief of salvation through faith alone. The belief that if you just have strong faith in Christianity, then you're guaranteed to go to heaven no matter what you do. So that would be the viewpoint that God will definitely save you, and it doesn't matter what choices you do or don't make, because the God will take care of all that for you, so you don't need to worry about it. Again, this then leads to people living very unwholesome, immoral lives. It leads to people not having any interest in knowing what's right and what's wrong, because in their mind it's irrelevant, because everything's in God's hands anyway. So that's a very destructive application of this kind of belief system. And of course, not all Protestants have that viewpoint or act in line with that viewpoint, but that's one contemporary example of this standpoint. And so similarly, what the Buddha is pointing to here is that if we are saying that our life is directed and controlled by some external being, then we won't take a sincere interest in taking control of our own life. We won't have a sincere interest in discerning what the proper courses of wholesome action are and living in accordance with them. Then in the third case, he says, regarding those contemplatives and priests who express this doctrine and hold this belief, Everything a person experiences, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, has no cause or condition at all. So again, this is the person who believes that there's no causality. Everything is completely random and unpredictable. So once again, he goes and asks, is this what you believe? When the person says yes, then he says, therefore, if you kill, steal, etc., it had no cause or condition. In other words, he's saying that one who believes in non-causality and non-conditionality also applies that to their own actions. They would also say, like, well, when I observe myself killing, well, that wasn't my choice. It was just something that happened totally randomly. When I observe myself stealing, well, that's just something that happened for no reason whatsoever. Certainly wasn't something I decided to make happen. So somebody who holds this viewpoint then, again, tends to revert to an animalistic level of just blindly following whatever urges appear in their mind, while rationalizing it by claiming, well, I can't do anything about it anyway. So this is quite harmful and destructive. So one of the things that we're learning how to do in Buddhist practice is how to recognize our impulses and urges, refrain from blindly indulging in them, and first to evaluate whether they are wholesome or unwholesome. And if those impulses and urges are founded in the unwholesome, then we do not express them. And we make an effort to uproot them from the mind. And we only act on them if they're wholesome. So this is a process of self-examination, self-understanding, and self-restraint, which leads towards purity and leads towards wisdom. But one who does not believe in causality, well, they don't see any reason to try to understand and control one's impulses, because as far as they can tell, there's no benefit in doing so. It would be a meaningless activity. So the Buddha also rejects this view of randomness or chaos, as being useless, because it leads to somebody discarding spiritual practice entirely. So he then sums up. He says, these are the three standpoints of other religions, which, if a wise person examines, probes, and questions, can be seen to result in a rejection of moral causality. Then the Buddha goes into a list of some standard Buddhist doctrines, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. He says, however, monks, the Dhamma which has been taught by me is unrefuted, undefiled, irreproachable, and unrejectable by wise contemplatives and priests. So he's saying the three previous standpoints which I taught, wise practitioners will discard them. But the Dhamma that I teach, the Dhamma taught by the Buddha, is unrefutable. So no wise spiritual practitioner would reject these viewpoints. So he says, what is the Dhamma which has been taught by me, which is unrefuted, undefiled, irreproachable, and unrejectable by wise contemplatives and priests? The 6 elements, the 6 domains of sense contact, the 18 kinds of mental exploration, and the 4 noble truths. This is the Dhamma which has been taught by me, and which is unrefuted, undefiled, irreproachable, and unrejectable by wise contemplatives and priests. That's the table of contents. He's going to talk about these 4 categories. The first one, he says, the 6 elements is a Dhamma which has been taught by me, etc. He says, monks, these are the 6 elements: the earth element, the water element, the heat element, the wind element, the space element, and the consciousness element. So this is one of the frameworks for investigating our experience that the Buddha speaks about. So the 6 elements are 6 categories of experience. So the earth element is experiencing hardness and solidity. The water element is experiencing fluidity and moisture. The heat element is experiencing temperature. The wind element is experiencing motion and air. The space element is experiencing spaciousness, and the consciousness element is experiencing mind, the field of knowing. So during this evening's meditation and Dhamma talk, we'll be looking at the 6 elements a bit more closely and doing some meditation practice around it. So I'll save further explanation for this evening. Suffice to say that this is one way of dividing up our experience. So the Buddha gave many different ways of breaking down and analyzing what we experience. And the 6 elements is one that he spoke about relatively often. Next, he says, the 6 domains of sense contact is a Dhamma which has been taught by me, etc. Says these are the 6 domains of sense contact. The domain of eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. So this is another way the Buddha gave to divide up our experience, which is the 6 senses: eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body and mind. Another way of compartmentalizing and analyzing our experience bit by bit. And analyzing it in terms of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. So these 3 universal characteristics of all things. Next, he says the 18 kinds of mental exploration. What does this refer to? He says, monks, having seen a sight with the eye, one explores a sight that is a basis for elation, a sight that is a basis for depression, and a sight that is a basis for equanimity. And he applies that to ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So things which make us happy, things which make us unhappy, and things which we are neutral towards, equanimous towards. So this is just a more detailed application of the 6 senses. So it's dividing the 6 senses into sensory experiences that are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So this is the investigation of Vedana, feeling, the feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, which brings us into an understanding of the nature of desire, aversion, and confusion. Greed, hatred, and delusion can be understood through understanding pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Then finally, he gives a description of the Four Noble Truths. And he says, the Four Noble Truths is a Dhamma which has been taught by me, and it is unrefuted, undefiled, irreproachable, and unrejectable by wise contemplatives and priests. This is what was said. What does it refer to? Monks, one who clings to the 6 elements enters a womb. Then there is mind and body. Based on mind and body, there are the 6 senses. Based on the 6 senses, there is sense contact. Based on sense contact, there is feeling. Monks, it is for one who feels that I indicate this is suffering, this is the arising of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the practice which leads to the cessation of suffering. So this I find very interesting because this is not the usual way that the Buddha speaks about the Four Noble Truths. But it is, of course, a perfectly valid approach that fits in line with the Dhamma. But he starts here by saying one who clings to the 6 elements. In other words, one who is attached to the phenomenal world, the world of conditional phenomena, the world of objects and activities and people and things. So one who clings to the 6 elements enters a womb. In other words, they experience rebirth. And in experiencing rebirth, then there is mind and body. So there's a mind and body present, which one identifies as oneself. And that mind and body has the 6 senses. So we experience sense contact through the 6 senses. And from that arises feeling. So pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, as I mentioned before. And the Buddha says it's through pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, so through sensation, that we can identify dukkha, that we can identify suffering. So in wanting the pleasant, there is dukkha. When the pleasant changes and fades, there is dukkha. In rejecting the unpleasant, there is dukkha. And when the unpleasant persists, there is dukkha. And in not understanding the neutral, there is dukkha. And in the unpredictable and surprising things which come out of confusion and delusion, there is further dukkha. So dukkha, then, he says, is something which can be experienced through one that has feeling, so pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. But he also says the arising and the cessation of dukkha can also be seen through feeling. And the practices which lead to the cessation of dukkha can also be seen through feeling. So then he continues, he says, what is the noble truth of suffering? Birth is suffering, decay is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish are suffering. Not getting what one wants is suffering. Briefly, the 5 components of clinging are suffering. So this is dukkha. So to be born is dukkha. And then once we're born, we experience the decay of body and mind, which is unpleasant. We experience sickness and death, sorrow, grief, depression, and so on. We don't always get what we want, and that's dukkha. And he says, briefly, the 5 components of clinging are suffering. In other words, briefly, everything in body and mind. So all of the 5 khandhas, all of the 5 aspects of body and mind are unpleasant when there's clinging involved. Then he says, what is the noble truth of the arising of suffering? And here he gives the standard formula of paticca samuppada, dependent origination. He says, based on ignorance, there are conditional phenomena. Based on conditional phenomena, there is consciousness. Based on consciousness, there is mind and body, the 6 senses, sense contact, craving, clinging, existence, birth, decay, death, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. In this way, there is the arising of the entire mass of suffering. So again, if I start talking in detail about dependent origination, we're going to be here all day. So unfortunately, I won't be going into a long explanation at this time. Probably another time I will. But briefly here, again, this is a bit uncommon in the suttas for the Buddha to describe the arising of suffering through dependent origination. Normally, he simply says that it's craving, which is the arising of suffering. But here he's giving a more extensive explanation of how it starts with ignorance, avidya. So starting with ignorance, with delusion, through not understanding the Four Noble Truths, through not understanding the 3 characteristics, then one creates this whole experience of body and mind, which the experience of body and mind is unpleasant. It's dukkha. And it brings with it a lot of uncomfortable experiences. So he says, this is the arising of the whole mass of suffering. And he says, what is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering? When through dispassion, there is complete cessation of ignorance, then there is cessation of conditional phenomena, and then on from there, cessation of consciousness, of mind and body, the 6 senses, sense contact, feeling, craving, clinging, existence, and birth, and the cessation of decay, death, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. In this way, there is cessation of the entire mass of suffering. So monks, this is called the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. So here also the Buddha is giving the cessation part of the Four Noble Truths in terms of dependent origination. So starting with the cessation of ignorance, which is brought about through practicing dispassion, which in Pali is viraga. So when we have dispassion towards all things, then ignorance fades away. Ignorance dissolves. When we have dispassion towards all things, then we can see them clearly. Our view of them is not distorted by craving and aversion. And we see them clearly, then we also recognize, as I was talking about last night, we also recognize that there are no separate phenomena. There is only the illusion of separate phenomena when the mind is affected by delusion, affected by ignorance. And when there are no separate phenomena, then there can be no mind which distinguishes one thing from another. There can be no me and that. There can be no me seeing that, me feeling that. That whole process can be seen as illusory, insubstantial. So then the whole system of dukkha immediately breaks down. When there is no me for dukkha to stick to, then there's no experience of dukkha. And finally, he says, monks, what is the noble truth of the practice which leads to the cessation of suffering? It is just this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So here the Buddha is bringing forward the whole Buddhist path. So the Noble Eightfold Path is a concise summary of all Buddhist practice. So again, I won't be going into a detailed description of the Noble Eightfold Path. For one thing, I've done it countless other times, as has pretty much every Buddhist monk throughout the history of Buddhism. We all talk about the Noble Eightfold Path because what else would we talk about? So I won't go into detail on it now. But again, pointing out that it is through, first off, right view. So the Buddha started off this sutta by rejecting three kinds of wrong view. So predeterminism, omnipotent controlling deity, and randomness. He rejected these three wrong views. So right view is the foundation of Buddhist practice. And then from that, we develop control of our body, speech, and mind. And we develop wholesome mind states. We cultivate mindfulness and concentration. And we develop a direct insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not-self. So that's the Noble Eightfold Path. And then the Buddha sums up. He says, the Four Noble Truths is a Dhamma which has been taught by me, and it is unrefuted, undefiled, irreproachable, and unrejectable by wise contemplatives and priests. This is what was said, and this is what it refers to. So again, emphasizing that unlike the three views of non-causality that he had spoken about at the beginning of the sutta, unlike those views, the Dhamma which he teaches, capstone with the Four Noble Truths, is something which no wise person can find any fault with. No wise person could possibly reject, because these are truths which can clearly be seen as leading to awakening, leading to enlightenment. So that's the end of this sutta. So at this time, I'll take any questions that you have. So please go ahead and enter questions. I see there's a few questions showing up already. So I'll go ahead and start going through these questions. First off, Kauser Friend says, this is Anguttara Nikaya 3.61 in my Dutch translation. Yes, so there are different numbering systems in the different editions of the Pali Canon. And usually they're fairly close. So usually they're within one or two of each other. But this happens in the Samyutta Nikaya and the Anguttara Nikaya in particular, where the numbering systems can vary slightly. So here, the version I was using had it listed as sutta number 62. The version you are using has it as sutta number 61. It doesn't really matter. Again, it has to do with, usually it comes down to when there's two short suttas right next to each other that are talking about the same topic. Then in some editions of the canon, those will be considered one sutta, and in others, it will be considered two separate suttas. So then that leads to these slight variations in numbering. So we're usually looking at the content to determine the place, to determine a particular sutta, rather than just going by the number. So if you just go by the number, then things can be confusing. So even with the ones where the numbers are the same across all editions, like the Majjhima Nikaya, if you just tell me a random number, like you tell me Sutta 92, I'll be like, okay, 92 is a great number, but I don't know what that is. But if you give me a name, if you say the Kitagiri Sutta or the Bahudhatuka Sutta, I'll be like, okay, yeah, I know that one. So same with this one. If you tell me Anguttara Nikaya 3.61 or 3.62, it's like, well, okay, random numbers. But if you tell me the Titayatana Sutta, where the Buddha rejects 3 views of non-causality, then I'll be like, oh yes, yeah, I know that discourse. So then Kauser friend asks, so right and wrong view is not so much about what is true or false in the absolute, but about what is conducive to liberation. That's one way of looking at it. Right view is also an accurate understanding of reality. It's an accurate understanding of the way things are. But right view is, in terms of right and wrong, something is wholesome if it either produces mundane good karma, or if it produces wisdom which leads towards liberation. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, of course, but there are also distinctions. So everything which leads towards liberation is also good karma, but not everything which is good karma is necessarily going to lead to enlightenment. Some things just lead to pleasant results, but don't lead to wisdom per se. Robin asks, what is the connection between neutral feeling and delusion? Well, the connection is that when we experience neutral feeling, we usually are uninterested, unless we've been practicing Buddhism for a long time. Usually we're uninterested, therefore we don't pay close attention. And when we don't pay attention, then we tend to fill in the void, either with haziness and spaciness and dullness, or with imagination and confusion. So that's the connection with delusion. So through Buddhist practice, we're cultivating a clear, peaceful awareness of neutral feeling, which then starts to open up those blind spots where delusion grows. Then Elaine says, if everything is affected by our past actions, does that follow that our free will has a certain range or degree of freedom? So one needs to be careful in talking in these ways, and thinking in these ways. So what I would say is that our present conditions are affected by our past choices. But what we do with those present conditions is entirely up to us. So for example, if yesterday you went to the store and you bought carrots and kale and potatoes and you put them in your fridge, then today, when you go to your kitchen and try to decide what to cook, when you open the fridge, you're going to see carrots and kale and potatoes. But it's up to you to decide whether you cook the carrots or the kale or the potatoes, or all 3 or 2 of the 3, or maybe you decide not to cook at all, or maybe you go out to eat, or maybe you decide to go to the store and get something else instead. That's all up to you. But what options are currently in your fridge is a condition created by the choices you made yesterday. So to that extent, you can say that your options are somewhat limited because of what you've done in the past. Another example would be that if yesterday you decided to go base jumping and you broke your leg, well, then that means today, if you decide you want to go for a run, well, that's not going to be an option for you. It's hard to run with a broken leg. But you can have the will and intention to run, And you can start creating the conditions which will lead to your leg healing so that you can run again at some point in the future, perhaps. So again, these are ways where you can see how past conditions affect the range of choice that we have. But that doesn't reject the fact that we still make choices. And when you do have extremely limited choices, you make the most wholesome choice that you can from within those options. And this then is Buddhist practice. It's recognizing that there are going to be some limits to our range of choices. As much as I might choose to go outside and start flying, that's just not an option for me right now. I don't have any wings and I don't know how to levitate. So flying is just not really a choice for me at this time. So instead it's looking, well, what options do I have? And what are the most wholesome options from within that list? Then Monk Life asks, Bhante, I noticed that many times people conflate compassion and patience with submissiveness or allowing ourselves to being walked over by others. Could you say anything about this? Yeah, so that's not compassion. If you're letting others walk over you, then you're not being compassionate towards yourself because you're allowing a person to be harmed, namely yourself. And you're also not being compassionate to other people because you're giving them, you're teaching other people that it's okay to hurt you. So that's not compassionate to anybody that's involved. So I definitely agree with you that these are not the same thing. Then Elaine says, I think I recall in a talk on cosmology that there are devas that delight in creation. Could this or these beings be linked to the idea of a creator God? I actually don't think of it that way. In the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha speaks about Mahabrahma forming the delusion that he's a creator God and then going around telling everybody else that he's a creator God. So that's more where I think it comes from. If you want to learn more about that, I think it's in the Aganya Sutta. Pretty sure it's the Aganya Sutta, where the Buddha speaks about this, how Mahabrahma arises in an empty universe and then starts thinking, oh, it would be nice if there were some other beings here. And then a while later, some other beings appear as the result of their own karma. But Mahabrahma forms the delusion that he created those beings through force of will. And then he goes and tells them, I am your creator, I created you. And then from that forms a being having the delusion of being a creator God. That's more where I think it comes from. The devas who delight in creation, I think of them more like artists. Kind of like many years ago, I saw a movie called Inception, where people could go into a dream where they could create whatever world they wanted. They could be the architect of whatever they wanted within that dream. That's more what I think about with the devas who delight in creation, is that they're devas who can manifest whatever they want. So it's like somebody who can produce three-dimensional artwork through willpower. And they have a pretty free reign to make whatever kind of art they want. That's more what I think of it as. And that's the last of the questions. So thank you all for joining in this morning. If there's no other questions, we can end at this time. We'll have another meditation and Dhamma talk this evening at 7:30, the usual time. So hopefully we'll see you joining in then, and we'll have some more Dhamma discussion at that time. So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, see you next time.